Good day, or good morning, or good afternoon, whichever it may be when you're listening. Thanks for joining us again here at the Scrum. We have a wonderful guest today, our first webcast in some while. We're joined by Aaron Good, um, a scholar and writer who has done an absolutely exceptional book, which brings us together. It's called American Exception, Empire, and the Deep State. And we've run two extracts from Aaron's book on the Scrum just recently. You can find them fairly easily. The headline tells you what you have, what it is. And this is a follow-up webcast we've been really looking forward to. Aaron joins us from the suburbs of Philadelphia. And welcome, Aaron. The book is put out by Skyhorse Publishing. It's gotten excellent reviews, wonderful endorsements, really seems to be finding its way quite well. Aaron, hi, and welcome.
Hey, thank you very much, Patrick.
Sure, yeah. I think the first thing we need to do is talk about a few terms, okay? One is exception in the title, American Exception. I want to be very careful because I think and write about exceptionalism quite a lot. I know our readers often have the phenomenon of American exceptionalism on their minds. That's not what you're talking about, exceptionalism. American exception is something different. I think you're using it in the way Hannah Arendt used, the state of exception. Maybe you can explain that, and we'll go on to a couple of other terms.
Right. Well, the exception as an idea in political science has dubious or sort of notorious origins with Carl Schmitt, who was the philosophical, juridical, godfather of the Nazis. He became a Nazi later, and he wrote that whenever the state is in an emergency, faces an emergency, it can't really be bound by laws that would restrict its conduct to respond to the emergency. And that's the exception. It's the exception to the rule of law. And he argued that it's really whoever the real source of power, the sovereign in the state, is he who decides the exception. And right. This is considered to be different from liberal ideas about the rule of law and, democratically elected legislative bodies that write the laws and, figure out how these laws will be, enforced and the rule of law will be applied. This is just saying the state needs to be omnipotent, more or less, to respond to emergencies because the existence of the state must be safeguarded at all costs. And so he came up with this idea of the exception. Now, he is also a guy who was a mentor to the father of American neoconservatism, Leo Strauss. He was a mentor of sorts and helped Leo Strauss in some ways and influenced his thinking. And that to me is a notable parallel. I think that after World War II, as the U.S. decided to embark on global empire, it realized that it would need to, if it wanted to pretend to be a democracy and so on, it had to be able to break laws with impunity to practice the foreign policy that it wanted to protect the world from communism, which is another way of saying making the world hospitable to capitalism, which is probably their main motivation. It wasn't as though the Soviets were threatening to invade the United States.
He who makes the law is above the law, as Agamben put it, right?
I mean, that's not what the American sort of myths say, but in practice, this is what it comes down to. And I decided I would try to, I would look more at this and how these thinkers, among other things, how these thinkers influenced American foreign policy. I don't go too much into the Straussians and their connection to Schmitt, but what I show is that the national security state has operated like a Schmittian sovereign, except that it does it covertly. And that's the difference between the Nazi Schmitt version of the exception and the American one, is that it's covert operations, and so we don't necessarily know when they're breaking the laws and the way that the exception is carried out.
Just very briefly, thank you for that. Just very briefly, two other terms I want to be clear about. One is deep state. Everybody knows the term. I think we should be clear about what Aaron Good means by it, and also tripartite state. How did you come to these terms? It seems to me, correct me if I'm wrong, by way of C. Wright Mills. And I'd love to hear you comment as you explain these terms. Comment on Mills in this context. Would he sign on for the idea of a deep state?
I think it's where C. Wright Mills' analysis was going. He just died very young. He died before 19. I think he dies in he dies in 1962, I believe, because he dies before the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was almost his prophecy being fulfilled. His last big book on this stuff was a sort of smaller sequel to The Power Elite, which was called The Causes of World War III. And he said the causes of World War III is going to be the preparation for World War III. And then he dies, but then it almost exactly happens that way in Cuba, over Cuba.
Yeah.
And he wrote the book, The Power Elite, in 1956, and it was inspired by his reading of Franz Newman's Behemoth, which detailed how the Nazi regime took shape in a very advanced, industrialized, very technologically advanced society with a high literacy, high levels of education and everything. How did this Nazi regime emerge? And he read that book and he thought and looked at the powerful forces that gave rise to the Nazis, which were connected to the cartels and the economic elites in Germany. And he looked at how that could happen something like that could happen in the United States, and how you could have this top-down system. He didn't say top-down so much, but it's exactly, but that's what he was describing to a T. Just that the people in the middle and the people at the bottom basically don't have any power. Power resides at the top, between the organizations that control the economy, Wall Street, the government, the political directorate, and the military, the warlords.
That's the tripartite state. That's the tripartite state.
That's the tripartite power structure that C. Wright Mills lays out. And he was saying that this had become sort of the power elite were the people who ran these institutions, and they were so unified in what they were thinking that they were really kind of a unified top-down source of despotic power, and democracy was becoming a farce. And so he wrote about these things and was hashing these things out. He didn't really know the half of how much things got decided in secret and where it really was a top-down affair, the U.S. empire. But he was really on to these things very early in the 50s, when most people were very satisfied and about America and America's place in the world and the future of liberalism and so on. He had a different take on this, and he was really on to a number of things. Now,
I was very young at the time. But I was old enough to notice that he struck a rather discordant note,
Absolutely. But he was very popular during his time as a sociologist. He was influential. He was probably it's almost certain that he was the person who influenced Eisenhower's speechwriter to talk about the military industrial complex.
Yes. Yeah. Your book, is it fair to say your book builds on Mills?
Yeah, I believe so. I believe it builds on Mills and Peter Dale Scott and Lance DeHaven Smith to a degree, and people like Sheldon Wolin have worked in this vein, and I think Michael Parenti as well.
Yeah.
I mean, it really, I think the guy that it builds the most on is Peter Dale Scott, and I think that's because Peter Dale Scott is perhaps the person who most clearly picked up where C. Wright Mills left off, in a kind of idiosyncratic way, because he was an English professor and a poet with a political science PhD, but he was such an iconoclast. But all the things he was writing in the 70s and so on, they just are a lot of them are very timeless. I mean, he has this essay on what he calls parafascism that he wrote in the 70s. It finally got published in the 80s in Lobster, and it's about how the U.S. rescued all of these Nazis and created a global network of transnational repression. And he was on this stuff so much earlier, and it was really it's the dark, pretty much fascist side of the U.S. empire that's hidden. That is the violence that kind of underpins this imperial project that C. Wright Mills was writing about as it was taking shape. But it exists. The reason that I have a tripartite conception of the state is that this exists. The deep state I define in the simplest terms as all of those institutions that allow for top-down rule in a nominal democracy.
Good. Right.
Okay. And it can refer to, it can mean in the broadest sense, more or less what you think of when you think of the establishment or the regime, okay, or the empire, the oligarchy. It could be roughly synonymous with those things, depending on how you want to look at it. Or it could refer to, this is where it gets, it lends itself to a focus on the conspiratorial side of what the state actually does. It can refer to those most secretive, clandestine elements of the state that can intervene with overriding power to affect things like the Kennedy assassination,
Yes.
And so on. So some of these most sinister parts of the clandestine state, so that you have the deep state, which is the top-down power, and you also have the democratic state, which is elections and so on. What we're taught about in school as like, what is the American state, is like really the democratic state or the public state. And you have this security state that was created at the end of World War II that's supposed to protect national security and safeguard the state. But in reality, the national security state was created by deep political forces, like top-down oligarchic forces in U.S. society.
Yeah.
And so there's the tripartite state, the top-down part of like Wall Street oligarchy, the security part, which could be either way. The security part could protect deep political power. In theory, it could protect the democratic state. As strange as that sounds, it could. That's what de Gaulle did when he went after those assassins and such. When they tried to take him out, he used the security state against deep political forces. Right. And the democratic state is what we would think of as the good part that's supposed to make a democracy work.
Okay. I was struck while reading the book, Aaron, and I mentioned this in my italic precede, I think, to the first extract, by the purposeful, systematic fashion with which post-war elites constructed the tripartite state you write of. It was almost as if they had a blueprint. Do you think that it was their conscious purpose or their conscious intent also to subvert democratic institutions, cut the citizenry more or less entirely out of decisions affecting the nation's direction, and set loose an era of official lawlessness, such as you wrote of? Was this part of the design, or was it fallout, collateral damage necessary to the project?
I think that you can make an argument that it was something that accumulated more and more power into the hands of a top-down, secrecy-obsessed, clandestinely inclined elite, that they acquired more power, which they parlayed into getting more and more power and so on, which is kind of the history of what empires do. But I would have thought something a lot more along those lines in the past. I now, after looking at these things more, think that it was much more premeditated than that from the beginning.
Yeah. This is the impression you give in the book. I think I left off the second half of my question. I think I'm asking how very bad or how unprincipled these people really were, right? I'm trying to get out their psychology, how they thought, right?
Well, and here's why I think it was actually more premeditated in some circles. And I don't think it was that everybody knew, that everybody was privy to like what the people at the top really thought. I don't think that. I think that the way Bretton Woods was designed, and some of these institutions like the IMF and the World Bank and the UN initially, there are elements of altruism and sort of New Deal democratic idealism that you can see in the way they were originally designed. Like the IMF, as much as it sounds, like as much as it seems a pretty obvious tool of US imperialism now, there was a need to, if you're going to have a system, an international system, you're going to want to have a way to help nations that have balance of payments crises. Like that's what on paper, that's what the IMF is supposed to do, for example. But it gets taken over incrementally by these sort of avaricious capitalist corporate forces.
Ideologues, conditionality, the projection of neoliberal
which they know does not actually serve to make the economies more healthy and robust and and to give them the resilience. They know that, but they do it anyway because it's to help the people
So
pick over the bones of these economies. But they
a
planned more of
considerable
this.
a considerable element of premeditation, you're suggesting, right?
Where I think that there is more premeditation, and this has to be a bit speculative because they've classified some of these things, but the person who carried out two studies, like basically the blueprint for American imperialism after World War II, is laid out in the War and Peace Studies Project, which was a State Department sanctioned venture carried out by the Council on Foreign Relations. I mean, they really mostly ran it, which is Wall Street's think tank, mostly run by Rockefeller at the time. And the vice president of this study, who was one of the main people carrying it out, was Allen Dulles. Okay. And Allen Dulles was a corporate lawyer going way back to Sullivan and Cromwell, where his brother also worked. And they represented the most powerful corporations in the world: Standard Oil, all the weapons makers, United Fruit, all these huge U.S. corporations would have been represented by Allen Dulles. And he wrote two annexes, or two parts of a report, or maybe it's one report with two main subjects on security and sovereignty for the War and Peace Studies Project, and it is still classified to this day. Peter Dale Scott and others believe that in this section, he actually calls for something like a CIA, because he was a OSS person, and that he had plans to basically set up a new, I don't want to call it an axis, but essentially that the U.S. would take over the management after World War II of the Anti-Comintern Pact, which was which was really the axis. And that sounds dramatic, but Dulles himself personally negotiated the surrender of Nazis who should have been war criminals. This was a treasonous thing by him. He wasn't supposed to do this, violating direct orders of Roosevelt. And these guys get brought into the clandestine apparatus of the U.S. right away. I mean, this is right after the war ends. They rehabilitate all of these fascists in Japan and Italy, and in German fascists, and these guys have become part of the new system under American auspices. So really, the Axis countries, especially the two bulwarks on either side of Eurasia, get folded into this new U.S. empire of Western capitalism, which is going to be neocolonialism instead of regular colonialism, and they are able to recreate and essentially take over management of colonialism and what you'd have to call the fascist project as well. And it was to take over the world, more or less.
You lead me to my next question. I've been eager to ask you this for some time. I want to talk about Henry Wallace, right? Who he was, his significance. He's a figure who's interested me for a long time because I've been another conversation. The 48 election was quite interesting to me, right? Anyway, or was it the 44? Anyway,
he factors in both of those elections.
Okay, yes,
he should have been the vice president 44. Yeah, exactly.
For a long time, Aaron, I have thought that the three assassinations of the 60s were the profound inflection point of post-war America, the time when the promise of a rational, humane order, domestically and internationally, was extinguished, or at least suppressed. Your book makes me wonder whether I had that wrong and it was further back. It was 44 when Wallace was bounced off FDR's political ticket. Can you talk about Wallace and his fate and his importance in post-war American history for a little bit? Also, I want to know if I have it right about 44 being the inflection point I previously assigned to the 60s. And just as a curiosity, what did they do to him in 44? Was it really like a lot of wet work or what? I mean, was it? And what did FDR say about it all?
Well, in 1940, Wallace was chosen to be the vice president over opposition from the bosses. So Wallace was the agricultural secretary before, and he had saved the U.S. with the saved U.S. agriculture with the Agricultural Act of the part of the New Deal legislation, right? And this, set up subsidies and, slaughtered a bunch of pigs in order to fix a glut in the market and gave the meat to poor people and so on. All these unconventional steps because of what Wallace called a catastrophic lack of statesmanship in the United States. So he was
Interesting.
he was just sort of the prototypical New Deal guy, a wealthy person himself, but a person who really was progressive and a lowercase d Democrat, and really a guy who was like not always calling himself a socialist, but most of his policies were pretty much like, we need to create a society. We need to privilege society over capital, even if he didn't put it that bluntly. Like, that was the gist of it, rather than allowing capital to dominate society, which is what had happened before the New Deal. And, arguably still during the New Deal, but whatever. The New Deal is pushing back against that. So in 1940, they tried to kick him off the ticket, and because the corporate bosses didn't like him, like party bosses, and Roosevelt said, I'm not going to run for re-election if you don't give me my vice president. And they caved. By 1944, Roosevelt's in poor health. They want to get him off the ticket again, and they're not able to. And Roosevelt wants to put him on the ticket, but they're not able to overcome the bosses. At the convention, they're about to nominate him, Claude Pepper, and Wallace is the second most popular politician in the United States. They're about to nominate him on the opening night, and he would have won had that actually happened. And Claude Pepper's walking up to the microphone. He's like 5 feet away. One of the people there knows what Claude Pepper, the senator from Florida, is going to do. And so he pretends that there's a fire. He says, there's a fire. We got to evacuate the building before this can happen. And so they're able to, when they come back, mess with the different processes. It's kind of a convoluted thing with backroom deals and so on, the way these conventions used to be run. And they're basically able to keep Wallace off the ticket through chicanery.
Jesus Christ, what a story. I'm glad I asked. Continue.
Yeah, Peter Kuznick, and it's told really well in Untold History. There's a whole episode, the second part of Oliver Stone's Untold History of the United States is all about Henry Wallace, and it's really well done. And as a result, he's replaced by Harry Truman, who is a guy who, as a senator, said, if the Nazis are winning, we should help the Russians. And if the Russians are winning, we should help the Nazis. And that way, let them kill as many people as possible. So he was a guy who wasn't especially terrible by the standards of the day. He basically came across as a New Deal Democrat also, but he really was a product of the machine politics of Kansas City. It was a corruptible guy, and that was the reason that he was picked in. It wasn't because he was remarkable. It's because he was just corruptible and had instead of Wallace being kind of an independently wealthy person who with semi-socialist ideas, Truman was a loyal machine guy, and so they choose him instead of Wallace.
The glorification of Truman in our time is just laughably preposterous, right?
Yeah.
On the other hand,
but it's perfect. It's perfect because he embodies the way you can become successful by just doing whatever the powerful want. In that way, he really is a paragon of something.
Another thing that stands out in the book is your account of the Mossadegh coup in 1953. Okay. People have that down, myself included, as a CIA operation. I think MI6 was in on it too. At least that's what the standard version of events. You write that it was the major oil companies, if I'm not mistaken, Esso and I think Anglo-Iranian, that developed the plan to depose Mossadegh. And the CIA was sort of a late joiner or something, if I'm not putting it too simply. Commercial interests, not intelligence or policy interests. Can you talk about that? Is that,
Right. This is the earliest CIA covert operation where they just straight up overthrew a government. They had done things like support right-wing forces in Greece and
Italy.
They stole the Italian elections also, right? But they didn't overthrow an elected government until 1953. Truman would not authorize this, but there were already operations being waged against Iran. They were already really suffering because the Seven Sisters oil cartel had essentially effected an embargo of Iranian oil. They controlled all of the shipping and everything else, and they were able to basically not disallow Iran to export its oil and really cause economic crisis in the country. And
Yeah.
this was done by not by the Central Intelligence Agency. The Central Intelligence Agency was using people that it knew to try to get this policy approved, but they couldn't under Truman. As soon as Eisenhower gets elected, they start planning for this, like actually formally, they start planning for it, even though Truman hasn't authorized it, because they know Eisenhower is a guy who rode to office on a wave of oil cash. And so they finally approve it. But it was really the Seven Sisters who did this and started it, the oil companies. And it's also worth noting that when the CIA got involved in trying to steal the Italian elections and so on, the original plan was not to have the CIA do it. People like James Forrestal wanted to have that operation done by private citizens who would just give a bunch of money to fund covert operations.
Right.
Right. And then they said, and it was Allen Dulles who was like, nah, we should take this on. We should do this. We should make this, bring this into the CIA's purview. And that ends up winning the day. So it just is like, it just shows you how much it's Allen Dulles is the corporate lawyer, and Forrestal himself was a Wall Street investment banker for Dillon Reed. And these guys, they were both totally in favor of these covert operations, but they were also realizing, like, we could just get rich guys to pay for these. I mean, so they understood who it helped, like, why else would these guys have given their money for that?
It tips into my next question. Is there a lesson here? This story seems to suggest it's large corporations, banks, and Wall Street law firms that are often, or maybe always, in the deep state's lead, right? What about this? Where is the balance of power in the tripartite state? That's
the story that I lay out is in the second half of the book, let's call it. The first half is is more social science and theory, dealing with the deep state and ideas of the exception and the tripartite power structure, C. Wright Mills, and so on. The second half lays out a historical narrative that describes how what used to be what you could call a deep political system in the United States before World War II, where you had economic elites who would work with the mafia and corrupt local politics with party machines and so on. This was the way politics worked in the United States for a long time, and it was there was a democracy, and then there was an oligarchy of corporate wealth, and then this kind of deep political system of, like, put together with local organized crime outfits and corrupt party machines and so on, would allow for shady business to happen, even though you also had the rule of law to a degree and political democracy in some ways. You had deep political power. After World War II, it gets in the national security state arises, and it's pretty much created along the lines specified by Wall Street super elites. So the leg men for the richest people in the world. And they create this national security state that's going to set up a global empire and manage it, all in the name of anti-communism, which is different than saying in the name of capitalism, but it's the same thing. Yes. And they go about, it cannot help but affect American domestic politics too. So these forms that they create overseas of manipulating democracy in other countries, overthrowing democracy in other countries, these things also, they not only give an enormous amount of wealth, the empire gives enormous wealth to the oligarchy in the United States, but it also gives them these techniques and assets to use those same tools on the American public. And, I think it's a lot of us and your listeners probably recognize that these were deployed in the US in the 1960s, where basically regime change and clandestine dirty tricks came home to the US, and they wiped out the left in the United States. Just like they wiped out the left everywhere else they could.
Yeah. I want to mention William Appleman Williams here briefly. Okay. You know all about what he stood for, right? But for the benefit of our viewers, Williams was and you're Aaron Good, the scholar, will correct me if I'm wrong, right? Williams was in the camp with Charles Beard being a founding member, right? That viewed American foreign policy as dictated primarily by material considerations, right? Resource control, market dominance, profit, and so on, right? There are other views sort of in the Wilsonian mold, right? Spreading our universalist values and so forth. There's also a theory, and I have quite a lot of time for this, that America's pervasive, obsessive sense of insecurity and threat is reflected in foreign policy. I wonder where you are on all that.
Well, William Appleman Williams was this progressive historian at Wisconsin, and his ideas on history basically become the Wisconsin School, which of U.S. foreign or diplomatic history, right, which is the history of U.S. foreign policy. And his argument was that once the U.S. had gone from sea to shining sea, the frontier had been closed. So he builds on the closing of the frontier thesis and says that without Western expansion and so on, there was a crisis as to what would allow the U.S. to deal with issues that had traditionally been solved by the frontier and by allowing surplus population to go west and so on. Like, this acted as a pressure valve for the problems of capitalism in the already settled parts of the United States. That you could always know if it was really, really bad somewhere in the U.S., for the first 150 years of its history, you could always light out to the west, set up a farm in Montana. And that seemed attractive enough for people to do that for a long time, which gives you a sense of how much it probably was not good to live in that time period. People were like, yeah, let's just go. Oh, there's land out there. That's good enough for me. Let's go. That was like a way that America was able to actually be a land of opportunity for a lot of people. Yeah. And with the end of the 1800s, you have the closing of the frontier. And it's a question of what the U.S. economy is going to do to deal with the fact that there's no longer this frontier. Are they going to build up their domestic market and sort of restructure the economy, have certain aspects of the economy more centrally planned along democratic lines? Or are they going to go outward and look to expand economically and deal with economic pressures that way? And that's what they decide to do. They decide to go for a global empire. So in the 1890s, they start going, it really was the plan of people going back to, as soon as they get California, they're looking to trade in East Asia. And so it's like in 1853, they send William Perry into Tokyo Bay and negotiate a treaty.
I never related Perry to all this. It's interesting. Yeah.
And and when you go back and further and you look at it, it makes sense because some of the earliest American capitalists, like the earliest American industrial centers, like the Lowell Mills in Massachusetts, they were paid for with opium money. Okay, the U.S. used to sell Turkish opium to China, and that's how the people that built Yale got all of their money. They set up the first railroad in the United States, was paid for with opium money. This is international trade, in this case, drug dealing, nicely.
Yeah.
And that's how the Delano family got all their money, the Forbes family, the Cabot, Henry Cabot Lodge is the opium family. So this is international commerce that's pretty much imperialist, right? This is a part of the American establishment going way back. And as soon as they get to the West Coast, as soon as they steal Mexico or California from Mexico, they're already looking to get out into the Pacific. And they, later in that century, later in the 1800s, they take over Hawaii, and around 1893, I think they annex Hawaii, but they overthrew that government as well. The sugar interests did. They fight the Spanish-American War, which is supposedly over Cuba. In 1898, it breaks out. The first place they attack is actually the Philippines. And they made up some excuse about how they were going to attack San Francisco if they didn't, but it was ridiculous. And the U.S. just sets that up as a colony because there's a lot of money to be made in East Asia. And we still see that today. Why are we over there worried about Taiwan and everything else? It's that there's a lot of wealth and money to be made there. We want to control the global economy. And this really is if you look at it from the beginning, it's like the first parts of the United States are just capital business enterprises, like the Massachusetts Bay Company, the Virginia Company. They were there to look to make a buck, settle some places down and make some money and help to deal with problems of there not being enough land and resources in Europe. that was the way it all started. And they just keep going west and west and west, more money, more land, more power. And then they get all the way to the west coast, and then they just keep going west across the Pacific.
Yeah.
And this is it's been inexorable.
So you're a University of Wisconsin.
They're the diplomatic historians that you want to pay attention to, I think. And they have people today
Well
doing
said.
very good stuff like Bruce Cummings, and then
Oh,
younger
yeah, I know
Peter
Cummings.
Kuznick.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
still a good but small tradition, even in the Imperial Academy.
yeah. Next question. I want to kind of bridge over to the latter part of our conversation, Aaron. Can you walk us through the development of the deep state, the tripartite state, after its founding decades? How did it evolve in the 60s? You know, you mentioned the Kennedy assassination, up through the Reagan years and the triumphalist 90s and so on. You know, it's a large question, the kind of question authors hate to have, but I stand guilty of posing it. What are the mile markers? Let's do it quickly, but
Well,
what were the big evolutionary moments, or is it basically the same banana all the way through? Not once it was, you know.
I mean, one way to look at it is as a straight line, or as a locomotive that gets they decide to forge this locomotive as World War II breaks out, and that they're going to go for global empire, and then certain people stand in the way of this, try to say stop, like Henry Wallace, and he gets, you know, knocked off the tracks like a cow getting hit by the cow catcher on a locomotive. And then the next person to come along and try to Eisenhower, with the Dulles brothers running the State Department and the CIA, Eisenhower is pretty much the cheerful locomotive engineer, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
then
yeah,
Kennedy actually wants to continue, I think, in the line of Wallace. And he also gets, you know, knocked away, swept away. And his brother wants to continue this process. They send a message a week after Jack Kennedy is killed. Robert Kennedy sends a messenger to Moscow to tell the Russians, we know you weren't behind Jack's death. It was a domestic right-wing conspiracy. The quest for peace that we were pursuing is going to have to wait because LBJ is too close to business. But I'm eventually going to, Robert Kennedy is eventually going to step down from his position in the administration, run for office somewhere else, and then seek the presidency. Okay, he sent, and then the quest for peace can resume. And of course, but that never happens because Robert Kennedy, who announced to people around him that he wanted to reinvestigate his brother's assassination. He thought it was CIA mafia types, working probably with some Cuban expats as well, that killed his brother. But he realized he had to be in the presidency to even control the state and carry out such an investigation. But he gets killed also under very dubious circumstances. And so these forces win. And you know, Kennedy's death led to enormous changes because of the Vietnam issue. He was pulling out of Vietnam, although he didn't have the political will, or he made the calculation that he couldn't pull out before the election, but he had already issued orders for all planning to be to effect a withdrawal that would be completed by 1965, the end of 65. He gets killed. The Vietnam policy gets reversed, and the Vietnam War has an enormous impact on U.S. history because it destroys the Bretton Woods system that had been put in place. And after much chicanery involving, you know, oil prices and the Volcker shock and everything else, what eventually you end up with is this new global system where the U.S. has control of the global currency, and it's not connected to anything tangible like gold. It's a currency that the U.S. can produce as much of as it wants. And this gives the U.S. more power by the time Reagan takes office. It gives the U.S. more power than any empire in human history because it can finance all of its military operations at a deficit, and other countries, the inflation that this should cost is exported to other countries because they all hold dollars as the reserve currency. It's replaced gold, which essentially makes the U.S. Rumpelstiltskin. And this allows the U.S. to have enormous power to pursue whatever policies it wants domestically and internationally for a time. I mean, and this after decades of this kind of power, you know, basically a couple decades where this is totally in full effect, because it's the 70s are turbulent and they involve kind of a restructuring of all of this. But after Reagan, it sort of matures this new Rumpelstiltskin dollar system. And so in the 80s and the 90s, the US was really unrestrained, and it leads to this hubris of the neocons and the Project for a New American Century to try to go for full spectrum dominance, a new American century.
Extraordinary. That's where we are roughly, right?
Well, we're seeing the end of it, because you generate your own opposition.
We'll come back to that. Please tell us, Aaron, tipping things in another direction. Tell us about your intellectual path. What led you into this material, and what determined your perspectives on it?
Well, it's hard to sum these things up exactly, but
of course,
I do.
Sorry.
No, I like these things, but I don't want it to turn into an hour-long session of me trying to do this. So I got to really focus and get to what I think is going to be most useful. I think that I grew up as a Democrat. My mom worked for a congressman, so I was always interested in politics, always interested in history, always loved Tolkien books and maps and so on, and even like political ideas that way, even in that sort of silly cartoonish form. Like I always found that stuff fascinating. But I worked if you're a Democrat, it sort of circumscribes your politics, right? And I was a political science major in college. Then I went to Taiwan for a year, came back, and then 9/11 happened. And so the early years of my life were Bush in the White House, and he just struck me as a criminal. I mean, even in the Nation magazine, which is now so kind of milquetoast as far as its critiques of U.S. imperialism.
Don't get me started on that.
I know. But they were writing very straightforward things about how Bush, the war criminal, and that Iraq is unambiguously the supreme crime of aggression and so on. And so this made me realize that this is actually quite significant, and it's criminal. And if the Democrats need to win, and then they can perhaps punish some of these crimes, and maybe we can reverse the course of this country. So I worked on Kerry's campaign in a really low-level position because I just despised the Bush administration. And then in 2008, I took a job with Obama, campaign organizer, field organizer, and I worked in Missouri. Went to the inaugural ball and everything. And then Obama, but I'd already done some reading by that point of like books on the CIA, like some of Stephen Kinzer's books.
Excellent.
And I read a little bit of Michael Parenti.
Yeah.
And I when I was a little kid, I'd seen JFK. So that always was in my mind as well, that like it was pretty obvious that Kennedy was killed by the CIA in some level. And then when I read All the Shah's Men all those years later, that impacted me. But once Obama got elected and he did what he did in Honduras, and then especially with Libya, but also with the bailouts on Wall Street, it was like, well, this guy's a total phony and a Manchurian candidate of sorts, or a Trojan horse, or pick your metaphor. But he is not what he pretended to be. And this suggests that there is something much darker and sinister in this. Like he's the other party broke laws. If you look at just the structure of democratic politics and ideas about how they should function, the other side has an incentive to enforce the law when the other side breaks the law, because then you can say my enemies are criminals and we convicted them, and it's very clear cut. They never did that. So why didn't they go after torturers? Why didn't they go after Bush for the illegal war? Why didn't they investigate the anthrax attacks? Why did they go into Libya?
But it's very interesting. It was the Obama years that tilted you in the direction of your current perspectives, huh?
Yes. And part of it, I'll give a little bit of credit to my friend now, Oliver Stone, because he went on Bill Maher and he had the book JFK and the Unspeakable. And I ordered it sort of on a lark. I either ordered it or I asked my wife to order it. And then I read that book very quickly. And I was like, oh yeah, I can't believe this. They killed Kennedy, and it's really very obvious, all the stuff these people have dug up over the years. And it's not even that, like, it's the realization as itself, oh, you could kill somebody and get away with it with covert operations, yada, yada. It's that it was actually really overwhelmingly obvious when you looked at it, and yet we couldn't do anything about it as a society. And then when I put that together with like what Obama did and how the crimes of the Bush administration, including the election of 2000 and probably 2004, that these things went unadjudicated, that there was some sort of lawless force that was really in the driver's seat of this country. And I set about trying to understand it. And I contacted people like Lance DeHaven Smith and eventually Peter Dell Scott. And they encouraged me to, go to grad school, and they helped me, give
Yeah.
me advice in different ways. And so this was what I just had to look at: the liberal idea of like how you can participate in electoral politics and somehow, influence politics in the United States is as a joke at this point, and it's really a lawless regime that is the empire. The empire has
Yeah.
taken over everything in the United States. It's really an empire, and most of what we think of as politics in the United States is really kind of a spectacle to sort of distract people from the business of running the empire, which is conducted without their input
You,
99% of the
you
time.
you've mentioned various books and writers who turned your head, right? Aaron, you've written the book that turns heads, right? You should be very pleased about that. Your book stands among those you've mentioned. Can you tell us in quite succinct terms what readers should take away from your book? Another impossible question authors don't like, but again, I stand guilty of posing it.
Well, I think it's a step that needs to be one step that needs to be taken in the United States is to just demystify and demythologize our sense making. This we at least need to understand why we are not able to fix any problems. The domestic problems we can't fix are related to
Mhm.
this same power structure, and there's a history as to how it came to be this way, and it's a history in which conventional democratic means of asserting public sovereignty have all been overridden in favor of steps that consolidate and aggrandize an oligarchy of corporate wealth in the United States. And these are processes and groups that we can trace over time in the US, going back really to its founding as a sort of capitalist business enterprise.
Yeah,
And we need to look at the US and what the US is, not be distracted by the villain of the day that we're always so fixated on. Like, look at this history, the history of this country as a whole, and look at the present as a whole. We are beset by forces that want to dominate and exploit us and fragment us in perpetuity. And it's causing us, we have crises that threatens human civilization. We have this huge crisis of inequality in the world. We also have climate change, which is, an existential crisis for human civilization, and the threat of nuclear weapons. And this
yeah,
threat of
yeah,
nuclear
yeah.
weapons hangs over us, and it should be unthinkable to even risk a nuclear exchange over a place like Ukraine. But the reason that we're in this position is because it's part of this US campaign to keep ruling the world in perpetuity. So the US, with its massive military machine, is fighting to maintain the US empire, and Ukraine is the mechanism for that right
Yeah,
now.
yeah,
And Russia perceives itself as fighting against an existential foe. And we're talking about the Russian nation state. And so
yeah.
this is why we are at an impasse, is the US can't tolerate any competitors. That's been its main, guiding prerogative, overriding prerogative of late. And
What?
this is why we're in the position we're in. We may not be
Yeah,
able to change it with what we do. It's probably going to depend on international events to weaken the hold over the rest of society. But when the US goes the way of all empires, which it must, or the world will probably end, there's going to be chances to fix things in American society and to reckon with some of these things that we have ignored and had hidden from us for
yeah.
so long. And I think that's really the start. I don't think it's like I can't put forward any plan for like actually defeating these forces, but we need to understand them, and that's I hope
Yeah.
to contribute to that.
You've wonderfully laid the groundwork for my last question, Aaron. I like asking this in interviews. I once spent a lot of time with this brilliant Indian sociologist called Shiv Viswanathan, right? At the end of our long talks, I asked him, "Are you a pessimist or an optimist?" Right. The topic was India's future. Right? Uh, and Shiv leaned across his desk and didn't miss a single beat. He said, an optimist, of course. If I weren't optimistic, why would I bother? What do you think, Aaron?
I think the same thing. I mean, I think I wouldn't be spending the time trying to look into this if I thought that it was purely an academic exercise. I think that these things are overwhelming, these human problems, but they were created by humans and they can theoretically be solved by humans.
Wonderfully put. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is what we if we weren't optimistic, we would really just give up and descend into despair and distraction. But overall, like even in America, I'm not anti-American really. I worked as a canvasser where you just knock on every person's door, and I would talk to Republicans and Democrats alike. Almost everybody that you meet, like you almost never will encounter a person who is as psychopathic as the people that are actually running things. So we need to recognize this. This isn't like we shouldn't blame necessarily ourselves. We've been subjected to the most sophisticated propaganda mechanisms with more money behind them than anything that's ever been, accomplished in human history. So we just gotta deal with it. We gotta be optimistic and think we can fix it.
I agree with you entirely, but I do hold people responsible for making the effort to keep their civic selves alive, and overcoming the propaganda barrage. It is possible. We are talking. We understand it for what it is. And people do bear some responsibility for themselves after all, right? Anyway, what are you going to do next, Aaron? What are your plans just to close out here?
Well, I'm running the podcast still, and that is a very, I'm a one-man plus operation, so I have some people that help me, but a lot of it falls on me, and that's a job a pretty serious job in and of itself.
Tell people how to find it, Aaron.
It's American Exception on Patreon. You can just Google American Exception Patreon, and we have lots of interviews with all kinds of people: Oliver Stone, Dan Ellsberg, Peter Dale, many things with Peter Dale Scott, if I didn't say that, Peter Kuznick,
good.
many people that I think are worth hearing on these subjects. And I would love to eventually, if I could get enough money to hire some other people, or we start bringing in enough money, I'd like to write American Exception 2. I already have the title for it, which is which it would basically pick up, it would be more historical, and it would pick up where this one ends. So it would start with Ronald Reagan, and the title would be American Exception 2, McJihad and the New Cold War. But excellent. I need to get I think I could write it in 9 months or something. I just need somebody to come along with enough money to fund it or something. So
Skyhorse I'd love interested? To do it. I think they
advance? Well, I don't know about that, but I think they would publish it. They asked me to blurb a really good book coming out soon by Daniel Ganser, the English version of that. So I think that they would. It's just it's going to be tricky to do it. I know I got a PhD, but I don't think it's realistic to expect to get a tenure track job. So I just thought, well, when I started it, I thought maybe politics would change by the time I finished it, but it's just gotten worse.
Yeah, I know.
So,
and universities are not the safe harbors they used to be. That's for sure.
No.
Aaron Good, thank you very much for the time. Here's his book. Skyhorse Publishing brought it out earlier this year. It's really a head turner. Wonderful scholarship, but I quickly add, written with great grace and none of the scholarly density we may associate with the work of academic people. Really a nice job and a nice hour to spend with you, Aaron. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Patrick. I love your work. I think you're one of the greatest essayists around who covers these topics. So I really, it really warms my heart that you like the book so much. And I just thank you again.
Yeah, we shall be in touch, my friend. Goodbye. Let's see. How do I